Okay. The Commissioners Court will meet in the workshop session. It's June the 7th, and it's now 11:18, in the County Administration Building, 200 South Texas Avenue, Suite 106. First item is the call to order, and the second is a presentation of the elections process by Trudy Hancock and Crystal Ocon.
Good morning, judges and commissioners. The first thing I want to do is go over the timeline for elections and talk about what all it takes to put together the election and have a successful election. And then I want to talk about the different kinds of elections and who makes the decisions for those elections. So first of all, we need to identify the stakeholders for an election. Most of our November elections are usually a pretty big slate. We have federal, state, county, city, schools. We can have the emergency services districts. We can also have the municipal utility districts. So there's a large group of people that could be on our November ballot. Or at any time, these entities could call a special election. Then we hold a meeting with those stakeholders to determine the locations, the equipment needs, and the numbers of workers that we'll need for each location. Then ballot assembly starts. This is a pretty long, drawn-out process. Each entity will submit their submissions for the ballot, their ballot language, whether it be races with candidates on it, or if it's a city charter or a school bond or any initiative like that. Those things have to be submitted to us in English and Spanish, and then we start assembling the ballot. When you talk about assembling the ballot, you start as far as low as setting up the precincts. So we currently have 102 precincts. So we start by setting up the precincts and then deciding which precincts cover what areas. And then you go on to putting the races on the ballot, and then the order of the candidates. There's a specific order to how things are placed on the ballot, and they're in the order of, I guess you would call it importance. I don't know that a county person would think that it's the same, but it goes by federal, state, county, city, and the locals are always the last thing on the ballot. So then once the ballot is completely prepped, that includes a paper ballot and our electronic ballot. Once the ballot has been completely prepped, then it will go to ballot proofing. Proofing is done by my staff. Then each of the entities, after we proof it, it goes to each of the entities to prove their portion of that ballot. I also have some outside people who don't have any stake in that ballot. Look at those ballot proofs also, just to check for grammar, for making sure our instructions are correct, making sure all of our races are on there. So when you're looking at proofing 102 ballots, sometimes we can have as many as 30 to 50 ballot styles. So it's a lot of proofing to do. Then we move on to in-house logic and accuracy testing. And that's where we take a small portion of the equipment and bring it to the office, and then we run like a mini election on it, just to check to make sure that the machines are programmed properly, and that everything, like all the buttons work, and that each candidate can be chosen, that the audio is sufficient, that the translation is correct, things like that. And then after we do in-house logic and accuracy, we also are required by law to do a public test. We have to notice that test, and it's put in the paper at least 2 days before we do the test. Public is allowed to come watch that test. And when we do that test, we have a predetermined test deck with an outcome that we already know what the response is going to be. So we take those pre-marked ballots and mark them, vote them again on the machine, and make sure that all those work properly. To do a proper public test, every race and every candidate has to get a vote, an over, and an under. So sometimes when you have a large election, it's quite a test deck to build. So after public test, if there are problems, then we go back and fix those. But if not, then we move on to sending out military. Our military ballots and overseas ballots are required by law to be mailed out 45 days before the election. So as you can tell, with military ballots having to go out 45 days before the election, we have to be set pretty much 60 days before the election. We have to have everything, the ballot built, all the program, all the equipment tested and everything around 60 days so we can reach that 45-day deadline. Militaries and overseas are always our first priority because of that deadline. And soon as militaries and overseas go out, then we look at our civilian and local people that we start, our local voters, that we start mailing those ballots out to. So those usually start within a day or two of getting the military and overseas ballots out. So we mail out those civilian ballots. Then next we start notification of our judges, alternates, and issuance of those writs, letting them know where they will be serving and how to contact the vote center where they'll be serving. The next step would be programming the equipment. Currently, we contract with Texas Voting Systems, and Corey Sims programs all of our equipment. On any given election, we deploy around I would say 400 to 450 pieces of equipment. So that's a pretty big task to get that all programmed and then delivered. So next we move on to training our election workers. Most of the time, if it's a November election, we'll train anywhere from 150 to 185 election workers. It takes a pretty good pool to be able to pull off early voting with 5 locations and then election day with 25 locations. So it takes an army. So next is delivery and setup of the early voting locations. That always happens the Friday before early voting starts. We have 5 early voting locations, and like I say, for early voting, we deploy about 80 pieces of an equipment, and we have 30 workers. So that's not a small detail. So those sites are set up completely, and then on election day, the judge goes in with the controller and just hooks that to the system, and then they're ready to go. Most of our elections have 2 full weeks of early voting. Our first week is normally 8 to 5, with a weekend of 7 to 7, a Sunday of 10 to, the hours changed this time, 10 to 4. You know, the legislation added some hours this time. So Sunday voting is 10 to 4, and then our last week is always a 12-hour days of 7 to 7 for the full week. After early voting, the judges bring back to our office the paper ballots, the scanner that holds the votes, and the controller. All of those things are put into the programming room in our office, which is a card key only entry. And so we know at any time if anyone has had entry into that room that's not authorized. So all of that stays in that programming room until we hold tally during the weekend before election day. And the rest of the equipment is picked up and returned to Arena Hall or the warehouse. The early voting ballot board consists of, if it's a November election, we have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans that are nominated by their parties. We have a judge and an alternate judge, and that board meets to determine the outcome of the mail ballots. And so they have a pretty big task. Our mail ballots are anywhere from I think the smallest we've had on just a small, like, school board election was like 600. The most that we've seen come through for the 2020 presidential, we did 7,300. So that's a pretty big task for the early voting ballot board. And so they meet on the Sunday before election day. Saturday before election day, after early voting ends. They process the ballots and approve the ballots that have been accepted already. And then anything that's rejected, we send letters out to those voters letting them know that their ballot has been rejected. Anything that's accepted, it goes into a locked box and is also put in the programming room under the card key door. And also that room is under live feed from the time that we start accepting ballots until the moment that the early voting board starts meeting, that room is under surveillance to know if anyone goes in there and tampers with anything. And that also has to be live streamed in accordance with last year's legislation. At the end of early voting and the ballot board is finished their preliminary work, then delivery and setup of election day starts. We start on Friday before election day. Some of those locations are delivered. A few locations are delivered over the weekend, but the majority of those locations are delivered on Monday. Texas Voting Systems delivers and sets those locations up. And again, it's the same process as early voting. The judge comes to Arena Hall, picks up the controller, and then on election day, that's all they have to do is they have to walk into the polling place, connect the controller to the system, and then power everything on. And so then they're ready to go. Election day, as you know, is a 12-hour day. Well, longer than a 12-hour day. Voting is 12 hours. So voting is from 7 to 7. At the end of the night, the election judge is required to turn in the paper ballots, the scanner that holds the electronic votes, and then their controller. So all of that is brought back to central count, which for most elections we hold central count at Brazos Center. If you've come out to see any of the numbers, you know, when we do results, that's where that's at. And so at that time, everything's checked in, all the seals are checked on the equipment, and then the media is turned over to the IT department, and they're set up out there using our equipment, and they load all of those thumb drives to be able to tabulate our results for the end of the night. And then after central count, we always do, the next morning, we'll do an in-house audit. And that's just a once-over to see, to make sure that we don't have any big discrepancies. Election night, everybody's really tired, and so you do some minor checks and balances, but most of the audit process starts the next morning. We look at the numbers of the people who checked in on the poll pad at each location, and we compare those to the number of ballots that were counted for each location. There are usually a few discrepancies, maybe one or two. Since we've gone to paper ballots, we try as we may, we do have some people that walk off with their paper ballot, not really realizing that if they don't put that paper ballot in the scanner, they have not voted. Even though we have people stationed at the door trying to catch to make sure that people are not leaving with their paper ballot, we sometimes are one or two ballots short at a location or two, and that is usually the reason why. Sometimes it's because in the primary, a voter may go in, check in, and then decide that they don't want to vote in a primary, so they decide to not cast their ballot. You know, there's several different reasons that there could be a small discrepancy, but we look just to make sure that we don't have anything glaring that we would need to check into to make sure that all of our numbers are okay. And so then the day after election, then the equipment from election day is returned to the warehouse. And then post-election starts a whole new process for us. We had lots of questions this time because we did have one very close race, why it took a week to get the final numbers. And there are several different deadlines that go past election day. So any civilian ballot or local ballot for our local voters that vote by mail, those are still valid if they are received by our office the following day, the day after election, as long as they're postmarked by election day. So anything that we receive in the mail as a ballot that day, the day after an election, qualifies to go to the ballot board. We also have militaries and overseas who have 6 days. So if it's a Tuesday election, militaries and overseas are going to have till Monday. This time, Monday was a holiday, so we had an extension of 1 day, so the deadlines weren't until Tuesday. So all those military and overseas voters, they have 6 days to pass that deadline. And then we also have provisionals. Provisional ballot is someone who either isn't registered, there's a new law now that was implemented, that if you voted by mail and you go change your mind and you go to the polling place to vote, if you don't have your ballot to turn in, then you have to vote a provisional ballot. And so we qualify those and make sure that those people, we didn't receive their ballot by mail, and then the board looks at those provisionals. And then also, you can also vote a provisional ballot if you don't have any ID, and then you have 6 days to cure that. So you have 6 days to come to our office, show your ID, and then we would take a copy of that, attach it to your ballot envelope, and then it would go to the board. So as you see, there are several different instances of qualifying ballots that have deadlines past Election Day. So a lot of people don't understand that and are not aware that there are things, most people just assume that election night is it. So we do have quite a bit of work to do after Election Day. The early voting ballot board is called in for their final meeting, and that's where they accept or reject any mail ballots, provisional ballots, military ballots, or defective ballots. There's been a lot of talk on the news this election about defective ballots and for people who vote by mail. And those defective ballots are people that voted by mail, and on the envelope there's a place to put in your driver's license or social security number. If you do not do that, then the early voting ballot board contacts you and tells you that you have that until the 6th day to come to our office and write that information in. So we hold those ballots until those people can come in and take care of that. So all those things have to go back to the ballot board a final time for their final meeting. And once they qualify those, then any of those late ballots will have final tally, and any of those late ballots will be processed and counted. And so this time we released our final numbers on Tuesday night after 5:30 because our deadline was 5 o'clock. And so the ballot board met and we did our final tally at 5:30. Then we also have what is required by law, a partial manual count. So sometime on Election Day, I'll get an email from the Secretary of State's office giving me 3 precincts and a race that we have to manually count. So that means that we have to physically find those paper ballots, pull them out, and count them by hand. And that's just a requirement, just making sure that our equipment is working properly. And that has to be done on all ballots. We do it on mail ballots, early voting ballots, and Election Day ballots. So we are required, like I said, to do, they send us 3 random precincts. We pull out those ballots, and then we have a team come in and count those. I don't know if any of you have ever, if any of you are there on the old school have ever done a tally. You have one person calls, and you have 3 people that mark, and they'll call that race. This time we counted the Attorney General's race because it was a statewide race and would be on every ballot. So that was, they gave us 3 precincts and the AG's race. After partial manual count, we have to begin the partial manual count the Friday after the election. So we have a real short window to start that. We do have 21 days to finish it. We usually try to start ours and finish ours within a day or 2 just to get everything finished up. I like to also be able to do those by canvas just so we have that assurance that when we go into canvas that everything was counted properly. The next portion is the canvas. That's the certifying of the votes as they were cast. As we'll see in my last slide, there are different authorities that do canvas according to what kind of election it is. And then after canvas, or it can be filed prior to canvas being completed, but you can file if you're a losing candidate and you have qualifying reasons. You can file for a recount. A recount has the deadline for a recount is 2 days after the canvas has been done, so that fluctuates a little bit depending on when your canvas is. And so the next thing I want to talk about are the types of elections. There's a general election, primary and primary runoff, and then special elections. For a general election, it's Tuesday following the first Monday of November. For a primary, it's the first Tuesday of March, and the runoff is the last or the third Tuesday of May. And then for a special election, it's the second Saturday in May. So each each type of election is controlled by a different set of people. So for a general election, the Commissioners Court sets early voting locations and hours. They also set the polling places. For us, it's election centers. And then they also approve the judges and alternates that are nominated from a list given to us from each of the Democratic and Republican Party. And then the judges in charge of appointing their workers. Most of the time we work with those judges to help them get their team in place. The county is in charge of training the judges and workers, and like I say, that's most of the time upwards of 185 people. And then Commissioners Court is the canvassing authority for a general election. Now, a primary and a primary runoff, the Commissioners Court still is in charge of early voting locations and hours. The parties set the election day vote centers. We do make recommendations based on historical data on locations that we recommend being used. The Democratic and Republican Party choose their judges for each election day vote center. And then the judge appoints their workers. I'm sure the parties work with them to help fill their teams also. And then the parties are in charge of training their judges and workers. And then the party is the canvassing authority for those two elections. And then for a special election, those can be anything from a bond to in May 7th we had 2 emergency services districts that had special elections. Thank you. So those are typically in May. I know that school boards can have TRE elections and certain other special elections at different times, but most of the time they're held on the May uniform election date. And so that political subdivision sets the hours and locations for early voting. That political subdivision will also set the locations for election day, and then they appoint and approve their judges and alternates. And then the judge also is in charge of finding their workers. The political subdivision is in charge of training their judges and workers. And then the political subdivision is the person who canvasses. In all of these instances, these entities can contract with us. They are not required by law to contract with us at all. But we do, by law, I am required to contract if they request to contract. But as far as I know, we hold all the elections here. We work with the entities here and are in contract with everyone for all the elections here. So. Any questions?
Question from the court.
I would ask, you make recommendations on polling locations, not only for early voting, but also for election day voting, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is the budget that is set up, I realize that's approved by Commissioners Court, do you generally run at a surplus, or are you behind the 8 ball? Do we do so many locations that we're spending more money than we've set aside for?
Well, this year I'm running behind because we had the special May 7th. So
is that a part of your consideration whenever you decide where to recommend voting locations? Do you recommend it based on, do you have enough budget?
No, because for a primary, the county doesn't really, the county pays for early voting, but we do not pay for those locations for election day. So no, that is not, my recommendations are made solely by numbers of voters and historically where we've had those locations.
Okay, can I use an example, please?
Mm-hmm.
If someone lived out in the east part of Brazos County, and I'm going to use Edge as my example, but
Okay.
somewhere far out in the east part of the county, for this most recent election that we've had, that person would have to, the closest voting center for early voting or election day voting would be Tabor, Arena Hall, I believe.
Yes.
Okay, it takes about 30 minutes to get from East County, let's say, to Curtin, which is a voting location on other elections. It takes another 30 minutes to get to Arena Hall, so we're talking about a 2-hour round trip for someone that wants to go from East County to vote. I feel like that's disenfranchising voters, which I think is a part of the thing on the decision on Galilee Church, is if we disenfranchise even one voter, then we've done a disservice to our community. How do you make those decisions? Do you look at that about how far somebody in East County would have to drive to vote?
I do look at that, and when we place those strategically around the county at high visible places, but we also look at the turnout for those locations and what it costs us to fund those locations, and then what, for me, historically, because I've only been in this county since 2016, I look at what's been done in the past. And so
I think in the
historically,
past is the problem. I think all of us trusted, that what we'd done in the past had worked. And what I'm telling you is we get fewer and fewer voters in these local elections. I'm going to use it as an example. There's approximately 60,000 population in precinct 2. That's not voters, but that's total population.
Right.
So let's assume 30,000 possible voters in precinct 2. And we've had 5 vote in this most recent election out there. That's not a good percentage. And then we're making it more challenging for people to vote. I can't understand what our criteria is. To me, the criteria should be that we make it easy for people to vote.
if I had the resources, we could open all 25 of them but that to me is being very, is mismanaging tax dollars when you know that there's not going to be a turnout. Okay, so just look at the difference in just the primary and the primary runoff. So we had 21,000 people who voted in the primary with 25 locations. We only had 12,000 vote in the runoff. And historically, those numbers do drop significantly, not just in our county, but statewide. And so that's part of what we use to try to determine what those are.
If I have to drive 2 hours to vote, there's a good chance I'm not going to vote. So that may be a part of or a contributing factor, if you will, on why those numbers are less.
Well, and you've got a week,
For early voting.
For early
No
voting.
question, but
At
Judge, I'm
least
going
a
to tell you,
week.
there are people in our community that prefer to vote election day. They choose to vote
That is
election
true.
day.
That is a
And
choice.
still,
It's certain.
even though you've got a week, if you've got to drive a 2-hour round trip, that's very much of an inconvenience.
If that's your only reason
For going,
to vote,
yeah,
if you weren't
yeah.
going to town to buy groceries or do something else and catch
Right.
the vote on the way in or something.
Excuse me, Judge. You mentioned the early voting, and I understand, Ms. Hancock, that the early voting hours, the first week was from 8 a.m. to 5. We've discussed this before. That defeats, in my view, and my understanding of early voting, that defeats the purpose of early voting because the working person, my neighbors, and myself would not be able to vote that whole week. And we've discussed this.
Right, but we also,
Is it-
I'm
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
Do you have sole discretion of the hours? Do you set the hours? Are those hours set by the state? Who
There's-
sets those hours?
The court does.
The Commissioner's Court? Okay, you usually just hand us
Well,
your
the se-
recommendation, and that's the way we've taken it.
okay,
But
so-
I've discussed with you before, 8 to 5 can't be considered early voting
But we-
for local.
Okay, so
Well,
the
we
do have a
statute does
provision.
require, the second week, because we're over
Yes.
100,000, we are required to do that 12-hour days. We
7 to
can
7.
choose what they are, but we choose 7 to 7. We also have a weekend that's a Saturday that's 7 to 7, and then a Sunday that's 10 to 4.
That's correct. But there's a whole week, that first week, if we're setting the hours between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., and we've got people going to work at 7 and getting off at 6, that person wouldn't be able to vote.
Okay, so, and let me bring something else to your attention, that Staffing is a huge, huge problem
We've
for
had that
finding
discussion.
workers. Okay, the last week that we pull, that's 7 to 7, come over there to our office at 7 o'clock on that Friday night and talk to those people. There's nearly every worker we have is over the age of 65, most of them over the age of 70. We have some that are 85. We have several election workers who are 85, and I am completely blessed to have them still working for me.
Yes.
There's no way they could manage 2 weeks. We could trade out and do, one group 1 week and one group the next week, but we do not have the staffing. We cannot find election workers.
And I do understand, we've had this discussion also. My concern is if we're gonna call this early voting and set it to fit the purpose, we need to do better with the 8 to 5 hours. It could be 12, noon to 6 or 7, but I would like for you to consider in the future looking at that particular issue. That is an issue for people that I represent. And I think it needs to be addressed because in my tenure, early voting was a luxury that working class people don't have if the hours don't flex for their working hours.
Okay, we have already started preparing for November, so I'm happy for any of you to send me your what you would like to
Well, I'm
see.
giving you mine
So
now, as I've given before.
So when we put those on the agenda for approval,
I would like
then-
to see, instead of 8 to 5, we could even do noon to 8 or noon to 7.
Now, there
but-
have been some statutory changes, and I'll have to look. They did restrict the hours somewhat to hours that we could do, so I'll have to look at that
Well,
to see
I
what those are.
understand, we've had this discussion before, but the concern I have is, what is the purpose of early voting? We're trying to encourage all voters
Right.
to vote. And if your hours don't accommodate my working schedule, then I don't have that privilege. I'm not going to be able. I can't leave A&M, come down here to vote, and go back to lunch for 1 o'clock. It's just not going to be possible.
Well, and I believe that in that runoff election, the first 3 days was 8 to 5, and the next 2 were 7 to
Right,
7. So we
right.
did
And
have a
that-
7 to 7. It
And
wasn't all
that's-
week, but we did
That
have.
is true, but I'm
We were required.
asking, and as long as I'm here, I'm going to insist that that those hours be observed from noon to maybe 8. We need some after-hour hours. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Right.
Okay. The
Commission-
other thing, I'm sorry, did you want to say
No, I
something?
want to say something
Oh,
with regard to
sure.
that specific
Sure.
topic.
Sure.
I think most of the issues we've heard from people is because things were different than they have been.
That's true.
And I'm a little bit leery of changing 8 to 5 to 12 to 8 because that's another change. And I if I would be if we want to do this, my thought would be is let's expand the early voting hours for the entire period of early voting as opposed to changing the times of part of the early voting. Because I don't want to make another change, because the thing that we've heard most people have a concern about is because there was a change in what traditionally was a voting location. So I agree with your idea, and if we can figure out a way to staff it, but I would much rather see it go in early voting when we look at the 7 to 7 for the entire period as opposed to changing the first week to where we would do that.
It must be, in my view, convenient and conducive to the working class getting to the poll during that first week, just
and I
like it
have
would
no-
be for the second.
Yeah, I have no disagreement with
And if you will
that.
allow me, Commissioner Aldridge, when early voting was first proposed in the nation, the hours were 7 a.m. in the morning to 7 p.m. that night. For 2 weeks, I worked it. I was there. Now that was considered the hours appropriate to get the working class in that number. And we still need to address that.
Yeah. Well,
We
like,
haven't.
I
and
didn't
it's
have,
an issue.
I didn't have an objection to your statement that you felt like early voting hours should be expanded for the entire period of time, but I'm a little bit reluctant to say we should make a change in early voting hours to where we go from 12 to 8 as opposed to, if my thought would be is if we're going to encourage more early vote and voting convenience, I'd just as soon expand the entire time as opposed to altering a part of the time.
And listen, I am not disagreeing, but the problem I have had and the discussion I've had with Trudy is the budget. It's not affordable.
I
So
understand.
I have tried to offer alternatives that would allow her to give the option to constituents to go and vote early, even if they're the working class. That's all. I don't really care if it opens at 1 o'clock, 12 o'clock, but I think the purpose should be that it remains open after 5 and not just an hour after 5, because if I'm coming from A&M, I get off at 5:30, I'm not going to be able to get to a polling place by 6. So that's the problem. I also have a question, and I'm glad we started with early voting. That's been a thorn in my side for a long time.
I have some input for the early voting hours. So I'm Crystal Oakon, I'm the elections coordinator. Early voting hours, I can see wanting to put them before work and after work during the whole 2 weeks. But during the pandemic, when we had the 3 week of early voting, my workers did not want to return for election day because they were tired.
Yeah.
I had new workers working at 25 locations who'd never done a provisional ballot. Now, we all know a provisional ballot can make or break somebody's race. I do not feel comfortable having new workers working provisional ballots, and that's a big deal to me. Also, about adding hours onto your early voting times, it's fine if I can find the staff from the Democratic Party, from the Republican Party, from the Green Party, from Libertarians as well, because they put their input in also during a general election. As in staff in our office, us that work for the county, for the elections office, we already put in so much overtime. And we
Yes.
are under fire right now with the auditor's office, HR department, whoever sees our hours. Like just this election, I have 105 overtime hours from the primary, the May, and the runoff. So that's hours that we're going to put more onto our staff. So if the county is okay for us as the employees of the elections office to work those hours, take those time away from our family during that time, and can either pay us overtime or somehow come to some type of conclusion where we can take the time off, because like now we had a November, we had a primary in March, we had a May, and we had a runoff. There is no time for us to spend with our families. And we had that during the pandemic as well.
Well,
So, and I understand we're here for the voters. We're here for them to get out and vote. We're all for the voters. This Brazos County, but I need people to work the elections, and if they can't, a poll pad is a iPad. If they're 65 and older, but now with the way the world is going, they're not going to retire at 65. A lot of them are going to be 75, 85 before they can retire. We're having to teach them how to work this pole pad. That it in itself takes a lot of time to teach more workers to do that.
And I can appreciate everything you've said, Mr. Khan. I have worked with you, and I know where you're coming from. But I've suggested flex time being used. I've suggested that we be more creative with the workers that are there. I am not for overworking you. I really do understand.
Yes.
The problem, again, is how can we meet the needs with the staff that we have? Again, I bring up flex time. It means that the people sitting at the front desk doesn't have to sit at the front desk between 8 and 5 doing just telephones or whatever they do. I'm not sure, meeting the people that come in. They could be, staggered. The times could be staggered. I mean, in my view, flex time is you can be very creative with it. And I'm not going to, I don't micromanage your department, but I'm just throwing out some suggestions. You mentioned the provisional ballots. My question with regards to the provisional ballot is, how is that counted? When is a provisional ballot counted? Question being, I realized that there were provisional ballots in every election, but I've heard different scenarios of how they're counted. Do you want to address that for us?
So a provisional ballot is offered to all voters.
Yes.
If they're not on the poll pad, if they say they registered to vote, and they can't find them, our judges do not let them leave the polling site without offering a provisional ballot, because that's going to give that voter that opportunity to place their vote, and then gives us an opportunity to go into our resources to say, okay, what's going on, why did they vote provisional, make sure we checked everything. So when a person is provisional voting, they go through the poll. If they're not on the poll pad, they'll go to the controller. The judge has instructions. I give them a step-by-step on how to do a provisional.
You're saying you give the
judges in their
at
supplies,
that polling place,
when they
at
pick up their,
center.
I have it in their red book, and I give them a printout. That is a step-by-step how to do provisionals. So at the end of early voting, provisionals come to me. I have to keep them in order by vote center, by early voting center. Then we lock them in the programming room, and they're under surveillance. And then at election day, I pull them. We go through all the supplies just to make sure I didn't miss one. We pull them, and we give them to, we have them already all listed, and then we give those to our voter registration coordinator. At that time, they notate what precinct, all the provisions are notated down, make sure we have all the information, then they start their reviewing them to seeing why this person wasn't on the poll pad, what's going on, was there an ID? I mean, there's all kinds of types of provisionals out there. Then once that's done, that is put into a transfer case, and that's handed to the early vote ballot board. Then they read what we find on our side, and then they determine if they're going to accept or reject that provisional.
So what would you say the percentage would be of the provisional ballots that are counted, that are actually counted in any election?
In the past, it's been very low, but now with the changes in the law for the ballots by mail, our percentage has gone up, not extremely, but it has gone up, because those voters that go to the poll without their ballot by mail, they have to vote provisionally. And so when that comes back, like Crystal said, we review that and see, oh, we didn't receive their ballot by mail, we notate it. So when it goes to the board, they accept that ballot. And so we do have a little bit higher percentage. You know what the percentage is?
And
We had,
I'm sorry.
I can't, I'm sorry, sir, you'll
We
need
really
to,
can't have
you'll need to
comments from the
step
audience
up.
at this time. You'll have an opportunity.
I think
he's our early voting ballot board judge, and he could give you a
He's-
percentage.
Understand, but
Okay.
He's got to come to the podium and identify.
yes, if
Okay.
you'll come to the poll, if you'll come to the,
We had 12 out of
Microphone.
12 out of 13 that were accepted this time.
12 out of 13. Now, that's a big improvement,
Right.
because in the past, it's my understanding that less than 50%,
Oh, much
Have
less,
been.
much less.
Well, in the past, before,
less than
They-
20% then.
well, in the past, you had to go vote at your polling site where your precinct voted. Now that we're vote centers, it really helped our provisional voters being able to vote wherever. They didn't have to go all the way back home and
Right.
go vote. So that's what helped that provisional.
But I'm concerned that those people that are voting and being sent or instructed to vote provisional, they think their ballots are being counted and they're not. That's a concern, because if you do that, you've disenfranchised my vote again. These are all ways that people are becoming frustrated that the voting process isn't working.
Right.
And
But-
I'm so glad you mentioned the mail-in ballot. I understand, and if I'm wrong, help me, because we've had this discussion. But I understand that mail-in ballots are sent whether I request them or not. That's not so?
No.
Tell me how mail-in ballots are sent.
So we have to receive an application from you. Sometimes the voter, if they sign one that was sent by a candidate, it may have the box for an annual checked. And if that box is checked, yes, you'll receive every ballot for that year that you qualify for. But if you fill out your application yourself and you just want one for that one election, and you just check that election on that box, that's the only one we send you. So we do not, we have to have that application on file with a wet signature to be able to send you that ballot.
Okay. Now, in discussing the mail-in ballots, I'm not quite sure that everybody is applying, but some people receive it all the time, and we'll have to explore that, the reason why some other time. We don't have the time. However, if I mail my ballot in and it comes back to my home saying undeliverable, what happens?
Why did it come back to you undeliverable?
Well, I'm sure it's the post office.
Right.
Okay, but what do you do about it? How do you know?
We have had, every election, we have people call that say, I put my ballot in the box and the post office delivered it back to me. Sometimes it has a sticky on it, sometimes it does not. They don't know why.
Yeah.
We instruct them, they can either put it back in the mail, or what we suggest that they do is to drive it to our office. And if they're a person who has mobility problems, we'll tell them, when you get here, park in the handicap thing, call us, and we'll come out and pick it up.
That's
And
great.
we do that quite frequently.
So, do I understand from this that you're saying that if my ballot is returned to me in the mail and I bring it to you, you will count my ballot?
We will process it. I don't have any say whether it's counted or not. The early voting ballot board does that.
So the process would be, it goes to a board,
Correct.
and if my signature doesn't match a signature on one side of the ballot or the envelope, they could either throw it out, or is there,
No.
no?
Now,
Tell me what happened.
now the new law states that you have to put your driver's license or social security number on that envelope. As long as you sign that envelope, as long as there's a signature on there and that pertinent information is on there, it is a rebuttable presumption that that is your signature. So the ballot boards are instructed that they are not required to look at those signatures any longer.
Okay, so they're no longer trying to match the signatures. That's a good thing. But suppose I am a 85-year-old, that, I've heard of fraud, Social Security fraud. I don't want to give my Social Security number out. How
Correct.
do you, and I'm not driving at 85, so I don't have a license.
Do you have an identification number?
By law.
I could or I could not.
By law, when the early voting ballot board opens that envelope, if there is nothing on that envelope, their identifying information, which has to match what we have on file, whether it's their driver's license or social security number.
Yes.
If it is not, then the early voting ballot board is tasked with contacting that person the best way they can. So if we have a phone number, they call them. And if they do not, if they have an email, we email them to let them know that they have to come down and do that information. If they don't drive, we have had some that we mail them back to them. But if it's close to the deadline, they're not going to get it and get it back to me. But we do everything we can.
Okay.
But we have to follow the law.
I heard of a complaint this last election, this most recent election, that the mail-in ballot was returned undeliverable. This person takes it or brings it to your office or to the voting poll, whatever, tries to turn it in because that's her vote.
Well, if she
Would
took
that-
it, if she took it to the polling location, they cannot accept them.
Okay,
We can accept them and if we talk to them, we tell them we can accept them, but only on election day. The law only allows us to accept those over the counter on election day.
okay, so we're not communicating these things, and people are walking around with misinformation. And I don't want to take a lot of your time, but these things are very important
Yes, ma'am.
to the disenfranchised, and I seem to represent a lot of those.
My staff went over and above this time this was the first, the primary was the first election. We had the new requirements to have the driver's license or social security number put on there. We could have waited for the early voting ballot board to meet right before election day and open all of those and find out that 90% of those people didn't put their information on there.
Right.
But the law allowed that if I wanted to, I could allow someone in my office to open that slot and make sure those were in there. On all of those, we remailed those back to those people. We mailed back over 100 ballots to people for them to fix that with a pre-addressed envelope for them to put that ballot back into and mail back to us. Just because once you cut that slit, then somebody could see their private information.
Right.
So we sent them another envelope to be able to send that back in. So we did that for the primary, and we did that for the May 7th and for the runoff. And for each election, it got a little bit better. So hopefully by November, more of our voting by mail voters will be have more of that knowledge that they need.
Well, Trudy, I can appreciate that, but when you tell me 100 mail-in ballots were returned, I am very concerned because in one election in precinct 4, if you don't mind me just flat out saying it, the election was determined by 4 votes.
Correct.
100 votes would have made a tremendous difference, I think.
Right. But most of those voters corrected and sent back.
So you got most of them, but
Yes.
not all of them.
No.
Okay.
How do we get election workers, and how are they paid?
Yeah.
They come from nominations from the parties. So anybody that contacts our office, we tell them to contact the party that they wish to work with. Because all of our polling places are equally staffed. So we have however many number of Republicans, however many number of Democrats in each location. And so once those names are given to the parties, then if it's in November, then the parties just submit us a list of workers that they have. They make their nomination for their judge or alternate, and then they just submit us a list of their workers, and we place those where we need them. Now in the primary, They do all that themselves. They choose their judges, and they place their workers wherever they want them. In a general, the county pays. In a primary, the parties pay. If it's in the November, we usually have the cities and schools on our ballot, and so it's split equally among whatever entities are on that ballot.
And is there a shortage of workers, in
Yes.
other words?
Extremely.
So we need to
There's
work.
always been,
So,
across the state.
so
That's the
how-
biggest problem that most election administrators face.
How do you think we could improve on that? Can we solicit workers, or give me some idea of what we can do?
You do the workers.
So I've been working for elections for 19 years.
I know
That
you,
is
you
my
were a
biggest,
baby. You were
That's
a baby.
my biggest issue is finding workers.
Uh-huh.
We have reached out to A&M, their students, their core. We reached out to some fraternities, sororities. Unfortunately, Tuesdays is a big class day for campus. So they don't want to miss class to come work a 12-hour day. We've reached out to, the parties. They know to go. They do their thing to find workers. The Green Party sometimes puts in their input. The Libertarian. It's just finding workers. And then, of course, they're up in age. So if they get sick and they have to last minute drop off, then we are stuck with a worker who hasn't been trained. We're having to retrain them, maybe a day before, and I do not like that because I feel like, they don't know what they're doing in a polling place.
Well,
So that's,
may I suggest, and I have nothing against you going to A&M, but here in Bryan, in my community, if you would maybe get the message to the local church and the local civic organizations like Bethune Women's Club or the African American Museum, the public that would probably answer your ad, you would reach many of those people. And I don't think they'll all be elderly. I'm sure some will. But to go to A&M,
well, I'm
it's-
not just A&M. I've reached out to the Hispanic Forum.
Yeah.
I've reached out to other places too.
Have
I
you-
solely put that on the parties because
Yeah.
they give me their names to who they want to, who's gonna work in those vote
I
centers.
understand.
So.
Put the NAACP on your list.
Mhm.
That's a nonpartisan organization. Okay. And they are very interested. They fought hard. I'm saying the NAACP fought hard for the right to vote, all people. So I'm sure you'll find somebody there. The other thing and this is my last concern, I promise you. I mean, I'm still concerned, but this is my last question. When you bring your recommendation to us of polling places, and who would have gone out and verified that these polling places are suitable? Point being, instead of Galilee this time, Palo Santo Street was used. We learned during the election that Palo Santo Street was under construction. And the poll, you couldn't get to the poll. I had one lady tell me there was no way possible for her to get there. Who verified this place? Who brought, to you, or did you view these spots? Because I know Tabernacle was closed because it was reported to Trudy that it was not inhabitable.
So when
But
we
we found out
received-
that was not the correct information. It wasn't the building being used, but it was closed.
So when we received the Bryan Ballroom,
Mhm.
information, I manage a local select team. We practice at Henderson Fields twice a week. So I drive that all day long. The cones that were up were around the inside of the new roundabout,
Yeah.
where the new they're putting flowers and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
And the cones were on the side of Palisoda. There was, I want to say, 6 on both sides because they're putting in grass. I drove that week. The week after I went there, there was no, they're going from off of Leonard Road into Bryan Ballroom was fine.
Mhm.
From getting out of Bryan Ballroom, going to the roundabout, going down Palisoda was fine. There's also an exit at the back of Bryan Ballroom to hit Palisoda was fine. Now, was there any mediums in the middle of the road? No, but you could see where they were, but the roads were not closed. And I physically drove out there and looked at that.
Okay, so you're familiar with the area?
Yes, yes, I am.
And a person not familiar with that area that would see the cones and whatever they
But there was
thought-
no street saying closed roads. There was nothing like that telling that you could
and
not
you
get
know,
into.
And that's a problem too, because if a person is not familiar with that street and it appears to be construction, who wants to damage their cars
Well, if you
or
know,
take a chance?
well, Arena Hall, same issue. That gravel at Arena Hall is terrible. We have caution cones up as well.
Yes, and
So when
I-
somebody drives by Arena Hall and see our caution cones, they're gonna think, well, it's under construction. Because
No.
now with the new school, as you not know, next to Arena Hall, they're building a high school. And so
Right.
there's caution cones right now, right next to Arena Hall. So I did have a couple of people who said, I'm coming underneath the bridge, I see all these caution cones. Is Arena Hall even open? Yes, it is open. Those caution cones are for what's going on next door.
I
So
beg
that
to
wasn't the
differ.
only place that I had,
I do beg to differ with you. Arena Hall is a little different. It's always got cones out there because they've got, well, the county, have holes. We've had that gravel for years, so I'm accustomed. I used to vote at Arena Hall years ago. Now, I realize that there are different concerns and different issues, but my concern is when you disenfranchise voters, you do us a disservice. When you make recommendations to us that haven't been verified or, we're led to believe, we go on your recommendation. We hired you, you're the staff.
I made those recommendations off of the previous primary runoffs. Galilee has never, in the last, not even in a 2020 when we had the biggest turnout ever, Galilee has never been used in a runoff for election day. It is always an early voting location, but it has never been used
We're
for
an urban
election day.
county now. We've got to start thinking differently,
Yes,
to be honest with you.
I agree. I wouldn't lie